What's up, y'all? Kevin Kuhn here from Athlete Factors. This is the Athlete Factors podcast. My guest today is Dr. Chad Kerksick. How are you doing today, sir?
I'm doing really well. Thanks for having me, Kevin.
Yes, no, thank you for being here. So let's go ahead and dive into it. Please tell us a little bit about yourself, your personal background, academic background, athletics, all of that.
Sure. So grew up in Southern Illinois, about 30 minutes east of downtown St. Louis. Got my bachelor's degree at Truman State University, a Division II school up in northeastern part of Missouri. Got my master's at the University of Memphis. Got my PhD at Baylor University in exercise, nutrition, and preventive health. Yeah, so Sick 'em Bears. I think that's our common thread, I think, right? So,
yes, sir.
Yeah, I like to tell people I'm very proud of the fact that all three of my degrees have the word exercise in them. So I've been interested in that concept for quite some time. Really got turned on to the research process throughout my master's degree. I worked with Rick Kreider, who's a fairly prolific dietary supplement researcher, exercise and nutrition researcher. He's the head of the head of the department at Texas A&M for quite some time, and now he's just kind of running his lab there. But currently work at Lindenwood University, a private school in St. Charles, Missouri, about 30 minutes or 25 minutes or so northwest of downtown St. Louis, for people that aren't familiar with the geography. Teach in the exercise science undergraduate and graduate program. I direct the exercise and performance nutrition laboratory there. We specialize in conducting clinical research trials that examine the impact of exercise and nutrition interventions on health, performance, and recovery.
Perfect. Awesome. Well, that kind of brings up perfectly why I'd like to have you on. So not too long ago, I came across a review that was published in the Journal of the International Society of Sports Nutrition. And a couple weeks ago, I had on Dr. Jose Antonio. So little shout out to the ISSN. But anyway, it's I've got it right here. So it's the timing of ergogenic aids and micronutrients on muscle and exercise performance. So there's just a vast expanse, if you will, of supplements and ergogenic aids available on the market today. And having a little background in nutritional biochemistry, and Dr. Willoughby was a pretty awesome professor when it came to that sort of thing. Like, he was always very he wasn't shy about telling us what things worked really well and what things he thought were completely bogus, just based off of things like the theoretical premise or just how biochemistry works. So this specific study caught my eye because I'm always looking for what works. Like, it's not the fancy stuff. It's not the sexy stuff. It's rarely, if ever, the new stuff, right? So it's, what does data say works? Because if you're going to look at a supplement label and you don't know anything, then you're going to believe whatever it says. And everything works according to the label. So I'm really excited to just jump through this study with you, because you were a part of this research group. So if you will, tell us a little bit about the study, just kind of the big strokes, and then we can kind of dive into some of the more the smaller details.
Yeah, of course. So this paper overall, it is published in the Journal of International Society of Sport Nutrition. It's free access for anybody that would like to read a little bit more. It was a review article that we put together that ideally was intended to try to bring to the surface the potential timing implications of various nutrients, in particular some non-nutrients as well as some micronutrients. When we discuss nutrient timing overall, there's and I mean rightfully so, the overwhelming majority of that information centers upon carbohydrates and protein, and quite frankly, as it should. So there's but the more that we started to do some work with timing, I got involved with the timing discussion I was a faculty member at Oklahoma, and I was asked to write the first draft of the ISSN position stand on nutrient timing. So we published that one in '08, and then we redid it again in '17. And in the amount of time from '08 to '17, we started to see more literature popping up on timing questions, timing answers that didn't involve carbohydrate and protein. We actually proposed to include this small section in the original timing document, but the authors felt like it just kind of cluttered the message a little bit. So what we did, we basically pulled it out and then wrote this article as just as a separate review, and to really, because I think overall, when we look at the ingredients that are highlighted within this review article, really none of them, particularly from a timing angle, really none of them are complete bodies of literature. I mean, anywhere near complete. I mean, there are as many questions as there are answers, particularly with this type of situation. And I think many times with writing, we try to do that. We try to take the information and summarize it so other people can digest it, and hopefully people will read it and think to themselves, wow, like I had no idea that this nutrient might have some implications for timing, and then maybe that turns into a thesis project or a dissertation or some faculty project. So that's kind of the basis as to why this topic came about. I like timing. I think it's fun. I think it kind of adds another element to it. It definitely, but I also think too, I think timing has been overemphasized. I think timing has been overdone in the sense that, primarily in the sense that, and this is, if the listeners could pick up on one thing on timing, is I think there's entirely too many people out there that are worried about the timing implications, but they don't have the other parts of the process locked up. They don't have the other parts of the process shored up. And that includes, optimal rest, that includes optimal training, that includes eating enough calories, much less carbohydrate, protein, and fat breakdown of those calories. Because I think if we look at it as a kind of a stair-step building process, if any one of those, particularly training and just optimal energy and macronutrient distribution are not in place, I would venture to say the timing implications of all these ingredients is going to be close to nil, because more so than anything, these supplements and the timing angle of them operate best. They're best put in a scenario of a good background or good foundation. So. Gotcha. So that I think is, when you say, well, why these ingredients? If you look through it, how the heck did they pick iron? Why did they pick bicarbonate? Why is nitrates in there? It's just really more of, we were attempting to summarize the literature basis from an evidence-based practice scenario of timing considerations for nutrients, and we basically all nutrients that are included in the scientific literature. So we dove through, did a lot of keyword searches, kind of surrounding timing and exercise and so forth, and we purposefully excluded carbohydrates and protein for this type of an article. So that's really why. If there were, the other thing too that people have to realize is that, for us, like a timing question is truly where the study design was developed to identify if something was consumed before or after a workout or within a workout. Like it was that they were truly examining a timing question. Just because something is given before exercise doesn't make it a timing question. That before exercise has to be compared to post exercise or to during exercise or to so that's another thing. If people were to read it and say, well, I think they should have included, so like citrulline malate, for example, was kind of on the fringe. We had a lot of discussions about including that one, and there just wasn't a robust enough of set of data yet for us to include it. So who knows? Maybe if we do version 2 of this type of thing, then some other. So again, if you look at it from the sense that hopefully people kind of read it and they start using it a little bit more, there starts to be more talking about it, and then there's some more studies and more things pop up, and then we have a little bit more reason to talk about it as well.
Awesome. So this is kind of maybe a leading question for those who are watching or listening, but would you say on the whole that when it comes to timing, that's going to be more of a priority for athletic populations versus people who just like to work out?
I think without a question. I mean, there's, we're still, quite honestly, if you put, Alan Aragon, Brad Schoenfeld on the podcast and ask them about timing, because they've written some very critical assessments just to try to provide some balance, I think, within the literature. Where and I think when we've had these discussions, and that's probably one of the neatest things about the conferences, is you get people like myself and Brad and Sean Arendt and Joey Antonio. We all sit around and have a beer and we just start talking about these types of things. And I think across the board, we all can universally agree that the more elite somebody gets, the more that they're truly tapping out their genetic and physiological potential, the more of an opportunity things for timing start to become.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the difficult part of the process is that people have to be honest with themselves and where they're at, and realize that just because they exercise 5 days a week and they exercise pretty hard for the 40 minutes that they're in the gym does not put them anywhere near, many times, the level of athletic potential and the level of athletic trauma and training stimulus and everything else that comes from, training for much higher intensities, much higher volumes across every single week of their lives. So that's an important consideration, and I think there's a lot of people out there that train really, really hard, that think that are really trying to do a lot of things right. So that's always a kind of a message that we need to try to share, because a lot of times it just pisses people off. Because you're basically telling them, like, look, bro, you're not elite. Like, this is not, like, we're having this discussion, but this is really not you. And again, I'm not really the one to really say who is and who is and shouldn't be kind of involved or it apply to.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the reality is that within everyone's spectrum of genetic and physiological potential, the more that they get and the harder that they keep going at it. Can somebody who goes from, they keep training harder and harder and harder, and they keep doing more and more volume, does timing theoretically become more important for them? And I think the answer is yes. Where it becomes important, when it doesn't, I don't think we can ever answer that question, because on one given week, you could be super dialed in to your training, your water, your fluid, your recovery. You could have everything locked into place, and maybe timing isn't really needed. Maybe you don't need to really do any kind of special kind of timing related implications.
Mm-hmm.
But the next week, hey, your work schedule might change, your training schedule might change, the environmental conditions could be, there could be a number of things that are different.
Mm-hmm.
And in those situations, timing might take on a little bit more of an importance. So I think overall, I like to come back to that, because I think over the last several years, I really try to emphasize that more so than not. It's not sexy. It's not what people really want to hear or talk about. But the reality is that you've got to make sure, like, if this supplementation or timing strategies are going to hold some level of importance, it has to happen upon the shoulders of excellent training and excellent nutrition. So the size of the effect, the potential effect of the timing of bicarbonate or the timing of caffeine is much, much smaller than the size of the effect of good training and good diet.
Mm-hmm.
So you got to have those things in order, really, before timing can really consistently kind of hit some benefit across the board. Sean Arendt and his group out of South Carolina just published a paper this week. Sean's a great talk on timing, and and basically another important perspective though, and this is kind of looked at it from the other end of the spectrum, because people might have just listened to the last 3-4 minutes and thought, well, he's not really saying timing is that important. But I think also too, when you're looking at it from the sense that you're living a life where, every every rep, every second, every fraction of a second is important to you. It don't matter if you're running a 5K to beat your neighbor, or if you're trying to break a world record. Like, it doesn't matter, right? If it's important to you, it's important to you. Rarely is there a situation where timing will hurt you. So then it just kind of lumps into, well, okay, well, if you're trying to do these things and they're important to you and timing might help, and there's next to zero evidence, I can't really think of any evidence where it hurts you, then why would you not do it? Why would you not try to take advantage of, if it's who cares if it's a little bitty window? I think that's what Joey would say. Who cares? Who cares if it's a window? So that part of it, I think, is also kind of another perspective, So really my comments more about making sure you have everything else in order. I get involved in entirely too many conversations of people that want to talk about the timing of something, and they train 2 days a week. They train 3 days, and I'm dead serious. Yeah. And I don't mean that to bash them. I just mean that more of them, like, they read something in a magazine, they listen to whatever, and they need to be told that, well, there's other big parts of this process that we've got to get taken care of. And so that's really more so of where my criticalness comes from, because I think people really want to try to gravitate to, again, like the sexiness of, wow, like if I need to ingest my caffeine 60 minutes before, because you said on the podcast that, like, that's when the optimal window is. But meanwhile, they haven't done, they haven't run more than 2 miles in the last, I mean, those are all things that people have to have it in order. Like, I'm not here to bash people. I'm not. It's just more, there's pieces to the puzzle, and those are some pretty big pieces.
Yeah, I think timing is definitely a priority, but it's not the only priority. And it's, maybe not, may not even be in the top 5, right. like you said before, sleep, and focusing on recovery, ensuring that you're getting enough calories, actually training intensely and applying a training stimulus. Like, the timing and the recovery stimulus means nothing if you're not putting the training in first. So,
and I think what you just said there, I'm not going to take long, but what you just said there, like that people can experience a hell of a lot of gains in whatever they're trying to do if they just stick to that process right there. Just hit play, repeat, play, repeat, play, repeat. So
for those who are doing that, they can learn quite a bit right now, going over some of these specific ingredients and ergogenic aids. So let's start off with caffeine. You briefly mentioned it, so tell us a little bit about that and how it improves performance. And
so I think, caffeine, obviously one of the probably the most popular drug consumed in the worldwide for centuries. Works in kind of a number of mechanisms. Affects what fuels we use for exercise a little bit. It also affects kind of some of the stimulation of our nervous system as well. So it works by it interacts with some key receptors of a molecule called adenosine. We don't really need to dive into that. I don't think that deep, but I think what does it do? How does it improve performance? I mean, I think caffeine historically has had a much larger literature base surrounding kind of endurance related types of activities, where we'll see with prolonged bouts of exercise, people are just able to pedal longer or run longer. They're able to maintain higher power outputs, or if they're cycling and running, cover greater distances in a shorter period of time. So if you're running a 5K, your 5K time goes down. But then also on the psychological side of things, we consistently see kind of like a reduction in the perception of effort. So people are using caffeine, a standardized workload just feels easier. So you might be doing a pretty hard, 45 minute bout of cycling at 80% of watt max or whatnot, but like your RPE, your rating of perceived exertion, how hard it feels. If you just do a simple rating to yourself with caffeine, it typically feels a little bit easier. So maybe you're able to pedal a little bit harder because it's easier. So you're able to go a little bit faster. So we've started to see some literature pop up more so with resistance exercise, I'd say in the last 10 to 15 years or so. And a few more studies that are showing that it might have some benefit to help improve like 1 rep max type activities. Definitely some pretty good evidence to show that it can probably help with like the number of repetitions performed to failure. So if you're doing, you're training in the gym, sets to failure, doing set, and you kind of do like a max rep set or something like that. And usually with caffeine, we're seeing, people are able to perform a few more reps overall. So that was actually, that of these nutrients, this one probably has the most evidence from a timing perspective. So there's a nice cycling study that was done where they gave a standardized dose of caffeine 2 hours before, 1 hour before, and I think maybe like 5 minutes before or something like that. I think it was in the form of chewing gum, so it was able to kind of get absorbed pretty quickly. And they found that 1 hour before was best. That actually led us, our group, I had a master's student who did a thesis project looking at with like some resistance exercise work. So we did a kind of a bout of leg extensions, and we dosed 2 hours before, 1 hour before, 30 minutes before, and it was and again we also found that 1 hour before was best. So I think from a timing perspective, 1 hour, 45 to 60 minutes before seems to be kind of the best the best angle, the best timing perspective. You know how much, man, I tell you what, people oftentimes are surprised at the dosages that are used within research studies. In this perspective, caffeine doses are usually quite a bit higher than what are commonly consumed. So you might look at a Starbucks coffee and think, oh my God, that's so much caffeine, or like a big, a fairly dosed up, energy drink, 12-ounce can of an energy drink or something that might deliver 300 milligrams, 350 milligrams, which is pretty high dose for those. And I mean, it's, the most common dosage within literature is somewhere around like, 3 to 6 milligrams per kg of body mass. Well, I mean, I weigh about 220 pounds, so I'm right at 100 kilos, so, I mean, that's 300 to 600 milligrams in one dose for me. And I'm, yes, I'm larger than the average person, but even if you take my body, cut it by a third, and now you're looking at, 200 to 400 milligrams. I mean, those are, for smaller people, those are consistently pretty high dosages. So, and there's literature that takes it all the way up to 8 milligrams, 9 milligrams per kg.
Wow.
And the part of it too that we always talk about is people need to realize like it's straight up pure caffeine. Like coffee, for example, has as many chemicals in it that somewhat kind of negate the effects of caffeine as it does to actually promote the effects. So, so the actual caffeine milligram dosage of like, if it's delivered in coffee is always thought to be a little bit less. And, we don't get into that discussion, but it's more of just having an appreciation that it's straight up caffeine that you're dosing. So, so I think when I kind of look at the different questions that you asked me, I mean, I think that kind of covers a lot of the different parts that you were interested in. Do you have any, is that right?
Yeah, I think that pretty much covers it. The one other thing I wanted to bring up about caffeine is, so just about all of this deals with the timing and the results on performance. And I remember a couple of years ago, I was at a Dymatize sponsored nutrition conference here in Dallas. And I think it was actually Dr. Sean Arendt who brought up this idea that ingesting caffeine after training had a profound effect on glycogen replenishment. I don't, like I said, this was years ago. I don't remember the study. I don't know if there's been any other research looking into that, but is there a potential benefit there as well?
Yeah, Kevin, I think I spoke at that conference on beta-alanine.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, but so when we look at post-exercise ingestion of caffeine with glycogen resynthesis, Really cool study. What's interesting it's interesting to me that that's really the only study that's been done.
Mm.
And it's funny that you mentioned that topic right on the heels of me saying really high dosages of caffeine, because so it was Peterson, and it was published in 2008 in Journal of Applied Physiology, and they just like a standardized bout of cycling, they gave a standardized dose of carbohydrate, so like just basically like efficacious post-exercise dose of carbohydrate that has been shown to stimulate glycogen resynthesis.
Mm-hmm.
And then in another condition, they added 8 milligrams per kg of caffeine to it. So how they came up with 8 milligrams per kg, I'm not really quite sure. Like that would be a fascinating discussion. But what's amazing about that is to my knowledge, that study showed the fastest rates of glycogen resynthesis that have ever been reported in the published literature.
Mm-hmm.
So that brings in some really, really fascinating perspectives and proposals from a performance nutrition perspective. Because, so like for example, we've got a pretty good rugby program here. You take like rugby sevens. I'm just using rugby it's more of the example is more about the types of activities in competition, but like a rugby sevens tournament, from what I've heard about them, they might play 6 or 7 games within a 4-day window, 3 to 4-day window. So that's where, this caffeine strategy definitely creates a situation where after your morning event, if you were to take some caffeine because you might have another game 2 hours later, that could absolutely be a favorable, effective strategy to help promote basically maximal levels of glycogen. Because there's strategies we can do to speed that recovery process up, but getting fatigued, getting dehydrated, damaging your muscles, all of that slows that process down. So again, any strategy that you can employ, kind of looking at it from the long game, because it's certainly quite possible that the team that has the higher glycogen stores, towards the end, certainly could, if it's fairly evenly matched from a coaching and physical perspective, that might make a difference. And so that is an interesting concept you think of, that for me, that study speaks to particularly to athletes that are going to be doing like multiple competitions within a day. Because the thing you got to be careful with about something like that is you have to imagine, somebody does, like a afternoon event or competition, or especially like an evening event or competition, and you give, 600 to 900 milligrams of caffeine to somebody, they're going to have an extremely hard time going to bed and getting restful, high quality restorative sleep. So that's just a perfect example where people, like, you got to think, like you have to sit there and think about what you're doing. You can't just, kind of basically read a headline and think, oh, I'm going to do that. And not even, and then you simply can't go to bed because of a super high dose of caffeine delivered at 5 o'clock at night after like an afternoon training session. So I think those are, I think that's another strategy. I think from a follow-up standpoint, like why somebody hasn't done, a 6 milligrams per kg or 4 milligrams per kg just to see where it's at. Because, shoot, what if it's a relatively small dose that's just triggering that response? I'd have to look at the literature, I think, a little bit more.
Yeah, that whole idea. So I work with a lot of endurance athletes here in Dallas, and a lot of them will do their long run Saturday morning, and then before all this Corona stuff happened, they'd all go to Starbucks and they'd all have coffee.
Right.
And I never thought that was a good idea. I was like, you drink it before, and then you're gonna have a better run. But then I heard about that study, and I'm like, oh well, maybe as long as they're consuming some carbohydrate at the same time, maybe they're actually doing themselves a huge favor. So who knows? So, all right, well, let's jump into dietary nitrates.
Absolutely. Well, I think overall, so this would be kind of one that has a much less developed literature base, but I think the studies that are popping up for it there's one group in over in Europe that are just doing a phenomenal job, just doing really, really well conducted studies. And so I think overall, when we look at dietary nitrates, where we're basically we're wanting to increase the production of through like nitric oxide is kind of one of the mechanisms overall. But nitrates have been shown to help like reduce the oxygen cost of exercise. So what that means, to just practically speaking, is if we go out and go on a bike ride and it takes, we have to consume, I'm just going to throw a number out, like 3 liters of oxygen a minute to provide enough oxygen for us to continually do that activity. With and without nitrates, that number, that 3 liters a minute, is going to come down. So you have to consume less oxygen to perform the same amount of work, and that's favorable because you're burning it. So that was kind of one of the initial aspects as to kind of why it might be important and why it might be working. So they first found kind of the mechanism, and then it transitions into performance, and it's like, okay, well, great. Like this reduction in oxygen costs, like that sounds fun. It's great, but does it improve my performance? I mean, a lot of right. That's all an athlete really cares about. Like I can talk about the mechanisms all that they want. They don't really care if it's not going to help their performance. And there's been a number of studies that consistently show some different types of improvement in exercise. It's definitely been slanted towards the kind of endurance realms of performance, as well as kind of some of the, like interval type, programs of exercise where we've got bouts of higher intensity and lower intensity. We're not really seeing much from the within kind of like the resistance training side of things. And I'm not saying it's not working. It's just science hasn't worked its way over there yet. So that's kind of what how do dietary nitrates, how do they differ from some of the supplements that claim to boost, nitric oxide? So
that's the interesting part. Sorry to interrupt, but it's so interesting that like there seems to be this, if not anecdotally, at least some evidence showing that on the dietary side, like eating beets and eating these vegetables that contain these higher concentration of nitrates have a decently profound effect. But like when I was in grad school, everything was nitric oxide producing supplements, and it was all L-arginine alpha ketoglutarate and all this other stuff. And so it's interesting that at the time there was no beet supplements for endurance athletes. It was all, hey, you've got to take this to increase your pump. It was all specifically targeted for bodybuilding and for strength athletes, I guess. So it's interesting how that, the tables kind of turned there. So yeah.
And I think overall, so like on the bodybuilding side of things, with like increasing pump and everything else, so many of these, the ingredients that are out there, like citrulline malate, arginine alpha ketoglutarate, and so forth. So they'll work to increase the production of a molecule called nitric oxide, which interacts with kind of the smooth muscle in our arteries, and it's been shown to basically kind of stimulate vasodilation of that tissue. And what results is we've seen reports of improvements in blood flow. So that thought theoretically, right, has transitioned then into okay, well, with improved blood flow, that will help to facilitate removal of byproducts and metabolic waste, and it also helps kind of usher in the delivery of of more oxygen, more nutrients, more favorable types of things as well. So that's kind of the overall basis of it, and that's kind of why it's basically linked to performance.
Mm-hmm.
I think what's interesting is that within that realm, within bodybuilding, there's relatively limited literature to support whether that's really kind of impacting performance.
Mm-hmm.
There's we certainly haven't seen as good as a well designed study as what we could have. A lot of times it's some different like pre workouts or like a multi ingredient product type
Mm-hmm.
of a supplement that has a number of different ingredients mixed with it. So you're not really sure if it's the caffeine that's in it or the creatine that's in it or the citrulline malate that's in it. And sometimes we've seen some reports of improvements in performance along those lines. But I think on the nitrate side of things, there's definitely some evidence that starts to point towards, like I said, the consumption of inorganic nitrate in the form of beets, beetroots and things along those lines
Mm-hmm.
have been shown to help kind of improve some different aspects um, of endurance performance as well. So I'm trying to think of kind of other as far as like the when I kind of look at the practical kind of the practical implications of it. I mean we've certainly kind of spoken around about that. Where we potentially might see some improvements in blood flow and kind of kind of thoughts about recovery. We've seen kind of see some improvements in endurance performance as well. But I think overall, it's important for everybody to understand that the body of literature here is not as well developed. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
this was actually one that I remember speaking with Richie and Richie Stecker, the first author, and the other authors on the paper, and being a little bit critical of, do we even include this one? Do we even
Mm-hmm.
include that from a timing perspective? When it's being ingested, is it making a difference? And there is starting to, we definitely want to try to consume that beforehand,
Mm-hmm.
because it doesn't really load up in the body, if you will. So it's similar to bicarbonate in the sense that if we consume it pre-exercise, it can change the composition of our blood and potentially have an impact.
Awesome. Well, then let's transition to an ingredient that has a huge body of evidence: creatine monohydrate.
Absolutely. I mean, you're right. Rick Kreider, my mentor through my master's and PhD, has done just a phenomenal amount of work as others have. I mean, a couple of quick statements about creatine that I'd love to share. I mean, I've heard many scientists say that creatine monohydrate is the dietary supplement that gives the entire industry relevance. It's true. I mean,
Yeah.
there's hundreds of published studies on it. So I think overall, if you have people that are saying, oh, there's not any science on it, they simply don't know what they're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
When you look at it from like a clinical perspective, and I think this is really enlightening to a lot of people, there's probably more research being done on the therapeutic implications of creatine monohydrate now than there are on the ergogenic implications, the performance enhancing implications, and people that just live in the exercise world, that just I mean blows their mind.
Mm-hmm.
And I've heard a number of different clinical researchers with more medical training say that if our body didn't readily produce the amount of creatine that it did, with its widespread need or widespread areas of importance across our physiology, it would likely be classified as a vitamin.
Wow.
So you look at so that's a pretty cool statement as well too. Now, I think a lot of people get interested in the different types of creatine. I think that's an area where the industry has tried to provide some other players, I guess, if you will. The overwhelming majority of the literature is with creatine monohydrate.
Mm-hmm.
There's been, alkalinized creatine or crealkaline, creatine ethyl ester,
Mm-hmm.
Creatine, there's a creatine phosphate, a creatine citrate. I think, I don't know if there's creatine hypochlorite so there's been some different, of those different types. Like we did a study at Baylor that stacked monohydrate against ethyl ester. They didn't see any difference between the two groups. Both of the groups basically, led to the traditional improvements in strength and fat-free mass. Andrew Jagum did a study at Texas A&M comparing monohydrate against crealkaline and saw similar outcomes. So I think across the board, when you look at the cost to benefit ratio, it's heavily tilted towards creatine monohydrate.
Mm-hmm.
There's many times the later formulations have taken the angle of it improves gut comfort. It helps to reduce cramping, kind of stomach cramps and bloating and things along those lines. And there just hasn't been enough systematic evidence to refute or agree with that. I think there's people are individuals, and we all have different aspects to our physiology. And I've certainly heard from a number of people that, taking a dose of creatine, it upsets their stomach. It causes, so it keeps happening enough to know that in some people that it's a real thing.
Mm-hmm.
But from a controlled scientific angle, there's just really nothing to say that one type of creatine is better than the other from a gut comfort. And then from a performance enhancing perspective, I mean, I think you get that you get that molecule inside your body and let it do what it does, and I think the body kind of takes care of the rest. So, I mean, what does it do, like physiologically, biochemically? I mean, the simplest way to put it is it helps our body to rapidly remake ATP. I think that's just the simplest way to put it. We consume creatine, a molecule inside our muscle increases by about 30%. That's called phosphocreatine. And then phosphocreatine is used by our energy systems to help remake ATP. That's just, I think, the basic way to try to describe it. So there's, from what outcomes can you expect? I mean, so we're definitely zeroed in on kind of more of a high intensity exercise domain. Performing greater amounts of work, sets to failure, interval type of work, higher amounts of peak power, total work performed across multiple sets, and so forth. Within a resistance training context, you mentioned Darren Willoughby before. He's done a couple of just marvelous studies when he was a faculty member at Texas Christian. They're just really well designed, really clear, focused studies that just help to highlight the fact that creatine does increase strength. That supplemented creatine does increase fiber size. It does increase the composition of a number of different components of our muscle that help with muscle hypertrophy. It's not, and I think he primarily did those because people would say, and unfortunately still say, the weight that's gained from creatine, oh, it's just water weight. It pulls water in. It's not really doing anything with muscle. All it's doing is making you kind of bloated or whatever else. And there's actually a paper published, but this was in the last month or so that looked at the body water changes after creatine supplementation and really kind of, and I haven't read it closely. It was just more looking at the abstract, but just kind of supporting the fact that the water movement that occurs with supplementation was not within the extracellular domain. It was inside the cells and so forth. They did a little bit more detailed analysis, but so when I look at it across the board, I mean, I think the simplest way for me to describe creatine is there is no safer, no more effective dietary supplement for an athlete that wants to increase performance from top to bottom. I think if you're like a true Olympic powerlifter or or like Olympic weightlifter, where you're doing 1 rep of squat or deadlift or 1 rep of clean and jerk or snatch, creatine may not do much for you in that moment because your activity is done in 3 seconds. Now the training leading up to that, where you can do that one huge movement, now we can have a conversation.
Hmm.
And then obviously on the other side of things, we're looking at endurance, ultra endurance, triathletes and things along those lines. Creatine would not be one of the first supplements that I would add to their regimen. And I
Hmm.
think many of them would get a little bit nervous about the weight gain. And let's be honest, if you gain 3-4 pounds and you have to carry it across 150 miles, like that's why, I mean, you could. So that's a decent argument, I think, as well
Yeah.
too.
With endurance athletes, because that's kind of my background, and that's the majority of athletes, adult athletes that I work with. I tend to I tend to play devil's advocate on that whole line of thinking and saying, okay, well, don't you want to go into your event as hydrated as possible? And like you said, it's intracellular. So now you've got this water within your muscle, which means the total pressure within the muscle is higher, which means you can exert more force. Um, Maybe that's not such a bad thing. If you're on a bike where your weight really doesn't matter that much, maybe that's actually a good thing. If you're running, yeah, you've got a little extra weight to carry, but um, you know, I'm not convinced that it's such a negative effect if you're utilizing it throughout the course of your training, your total training cycle or phase, if you will. But it's endurance sports are rife
Well,
with worry about weight. So
yeah, and I think what needs to happen there is that, again, like those endurance athletes need to realize full well that many times the drastic improvements in strength and fat-free mass that we see with creatine supplementation, you know, is, there's a huge training stimulus component that's going on with how that athlete's training, and endurance athletes are training in a different manner. So the my point is, so the magnitude of the weight gain or fat-free mass accretion that we would see isn't going to happen with an endurance athlete, because they're simply they're not providing that type of a stimulus.
mhm.
um, and there's so creatine's benefits are so widespread across the cell and across different tissues. It'll though I think there's still days ahead where people will start to examine just, I mean, more specific endurance questions across the board, because
Mhm.
maybe it's not, maybe it's less about the performance on that given day, but it's more about your body's ability to withstand the training rigors of a traditional endurance training regimen.
Mhm.
Maybe that's where it's at.
Yeah.
Maybe it's not about just getting on the bike and cranking out power, and it's more about being able to withstand, the overall training calendar to put you in a
All
position
that
to perform well.
damage.
Yeah, you have to be open minded to it,
Mhm.
but I think overall, energetically, it definitely makes the most sense to look at and to look at an anaerobic athlete, but that does not mean that we exclude certain athletes just because we know. So so that's what I mean. I think overall, the creatine work initially hyper focused in on that area, and we kind of clearly got some evidence that it helps within that anaerobic domain. Then it's really there's not as much creatine work being done right now, to be
Mhm.
honest with you. Everyone's just kind of accepted the fact that it works. The other thing that I'll say on creatine, because I think it needs to be said, is there's absolutely no evidence within the scientific literature that in people that don't have any underlying health conditions that it's harmful to your health.
Mhm.
There's well controlled, randomized, double blind, placebo controlled studies that have been conducted for the purpose of examining safety, and there's nothing that consistently pops up. The media would be all over it if something well controlled and substantiated came about,
Mhm.
because they jump on it if, you know, Joe Blow on the weekend goes into the hospital and has muscle cramps, and he was taking creatine. It's likely going to be on usatoday.com on Monday. I mean, it's
Yep.
just, and that's me being pissy about it. But that's just, so I think, for people that are concerned about it from the safety angle, I would caution them that if they're healthy, they have no underlying, kind of medical concerns or conditions or diseases, there's nothing in the literature to say that they should have a problem.
Gotcha. So for the sake of time, I wish we could cover everything else. You know, the study covered iron, calcium, sodium bicarbonate, beta alanine, some others.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I mean, if the response to this was good, I mean, just send me a message. Let's just set up part 2.
Perfect.
Let's just do it. That. I mean, I don't, awesome. We can follow up with some of the other things and kind of go from there. So,
cool.
But yeah, I do apologize for kind of having to cut it short, but but I think overall, it's a neat topic, and like I said, hopefully we get some feedback or some questions. We can cover some more things as well too. So
awesome. So real quick, can you share with everybody how can we follow you, your work, Instagram, Twitter, any of that stuff?
Kevin, I'm one of those academics who really doesn't do a very good job on social media. I'm on Facebook. It's just my first name, last name, Chad Kerksick, at Chad Kerksick, on Instagram and Twitter. I honestly don't use Instagram hardly. I don't, and I'm just being honest. So like if somebody's all excited and think they're gonna be very disappointed. It's absolutely the part of, I guess, my lab or my brand or whatever the heck that I'm not doing as much as what I could. But I haven't figured out how to find the time yet to do that. So
gotcha.
Yeah, but yeah, I'm out there. Like I said, I will say if somebody messages me through Facebook and I'll respond to them. So,
awesome. Sweet. Yeah. Dr. Kerksick, thank you so much for taking the time to do this. I really appreciate it. I'd love to have you on again to discuss the rest.
Yeah,
so
let's do it. Just circle back and we can do it sooner than later. It's up to you.
Awesome. Sounds great. All right, y'all. Thanks for watching and listening.
You betcha. Take care, everybody.
Yeah. Adios.
Bye-bye.